The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Cedar Falls as Dr. Sarah chin pressed her back against the brick wall of the abandoned pharmacy, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. 3 days had passed since the emergency broadcast system had gone silent, and the world she once knew had crumbled into chaos. The infection had spread faster than anyone could have predicted, transforming ordinary citizens into mindless creatures driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Sarah clutched her medical bag tighter, knowing that the antibiotics and supplies inside might be the difference between life and death for the small group of survivors holed up in the community center 6 blocks away. The sound of shuffling feet echoed from around the corner, accompanied by the distinctive guttural moans that had become the soundtrack of this new nightmare. Sarah's training as an emergency room physician had prepared her for many crises, but nothing could have readied her for the sight of her former colleagues and patients wandering the halls of Cedar Falls General Hospital with vacant, bloodshot eyes and an unending desire to feed. She had barely escaped that first night, watching in horror as the infection spread through the hospital like wildfire, turning healers into hunters within hours. Behind her, the pharmacy's shattered windows reflected the smoke rising from various points across the city. The military had attempted to establish quarantine zones, but their efforts had failed spectacularly when infected individuals had breached the perimeters. Now, the few remaining soldiers had either fled or joined the growing ranks of the undead. Sarah had witnessed the fall of the last checkpoint from her hiding spot in the pharmacy storage room, watching as Sergeant Martinez, a man who had saved dozens of civilians, succumbed to a bite wound and turned on his own squad within minutes. The survivors at the community center were counting on her return. There was Tommy, a 16-year-old who had lost his entire family but possessed an uncanny ability to hotwire vehicles and navigate the city's back alleys. Maria, a former construction worker whose knowledge of the city's infrastructure had proven invaluable in planning escape routes. Then there was Father O'Brien, whose calm demeanor and unwavering faith had become an anchor for the group's sanity, even as the world around them descended into madness. Most critically, there was little Emma, the 8-year-old daughter of a nurse who had died protecting the group during their initial escape from the hospital. Emma had developed a high fever, and without the proper medication, Sarah feared they might lose her too. A metallic crash from the street made Sarah freeze. Through the cracked window, she could see a small horde of zombies stumbling through the intersection, their movements erratic but purposeful. They moved in loose formations, drawn by sounds and scents that living humans couldn't detect. Sarah had observed their behavior over the past few days, noting that they seemed to retain some primitive pack instincts despite their deteriorated cognitive abilities. They were slower during the day, sluggish in the heat, but as evening approached they became more active, more dangerous. The radio in her backpack crackled to life with a burst of static, causing her heart to race. She quickly turned the volume down, but not before catching fragments of a transmission. Safe zone established. Fort Henderson. Military protection. Survivors welcome. The signal faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Sarah with a glimmer of hope. Fort Henderson was nearly 200 miles away, but it represented something they desperately needed. A chance at survival, at rebuilding, at finding others who refused to give up. As she prepared to make her move back to the community center, Sarah reflected on how quickly civilization had collapsed. The infection had initially been reported as an isolated incident at a research facility outside the city. Within 72 hours, it had spread throughout the metropolitan area, overwhelming hospitals, police stations, and emergency services. The government's response had been too little, too late. Now, the few remaining survivors were left to fend for themselves in a world where the dead outnumbered the living, and every decision could mean the difference between salvation and joining the ranks of the undead. The shuffling sounds grew fainter as the horde moved away from her position. Sarah took a deep breath, shouldered her medical bag, and stepped out into the street. The journey back to the community center would be dangerous, but her fellow survivors were depending on her. As she moved through the shadows, avoiding the main roads and staying close to buildings that offered cover, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The infection was still spreading, the zombies were growing in numbers, and somewhere out there, other groups of survivors were fighting their own desperate battles for survival. The end had begun, but perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late to fight back. The community center's reinforced doors groaned under the relentless pounding as dozens of zombies pressed against the barricades, their decaying hands clawing at the wood and metal barriers that stood between them and the terrified survivors inside. Sarah pressed her ear to the radio, desperately trying to tune into any frequency that might connect them with other survivor groups, while Tommy worked frantically to reinforce the windows with furniture and anything else they could find. The attack had begun at sunset, just as Sarah had predicted, but the sheer number of infected individuals surrounding their sanctuary was far beyond anything they had encountered before. What had started as a few scattered zombies wandering through the parking lot had quickly escalated into a coordinated assault that seemed almost planned, as if the creatures were learning to work together in ways that defied their supposed mindless nature. Father O'Brien knelt beside Emma, whose fever had broken thanks to the antibiotic Sarah had retrieved, but the child's eyes were wide with terror as the sounds of the undead grew louder and more persistent. Maria had taken position at the main entrance, her construction background proving invaluable as she directed the placement of heavy tables and cabinets to create multiple layers of defense. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the building as one of the side doors began to give way under the pressure, causing everyone to freeze in momentary panic before springing into action. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and positioned herself in the center of the main room, knowing that injuries were inevitable and that her skills would be the difference between life and death for anyone who got hurt. The first breach came from the kitchen area, where a small group of zombies had managed to break through a window that had been inadequately secured. Tommy reacted instantly, using a baseball bat he had found to defend the opening while Maria rushed to help him push a refrigerator against the gap. But as they fought, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. These zombies moved with more purpose than the others she had observed, their attacks more coordinated, their responses to the survivors' movements more calculated. One of them, a former police officer still wearing remnants of his uniform, actually seemed to be directing the others, pointing toward weak spots in their defenses and making what could only be described as tactical decisions. The radio suddenly crackled to life with a clear transmission. "This is Captain Reynolds at the old fire station on 5th Street. We have 23 survivors and are under heavy assault. Anyone receiving this, please respond. We're running low on ammunition and need immediate assistance." Sarah's heart leaped with hope and fear simultaneously. There were other survivors, but they were in the same desperate situation, fighting for their lives against an enemy that seemed to be growing stronger and smarter with each passing hour. She quickly responded, giving their location and situation, only to receive similar distress calls from 3 other groups scattered across the city. The zombie apocalypse was far from over, and it was becoming clear that the infection was indeed evolving, transforming the undead into something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As the night wore on, the survivors managed to repel the initial assault, but not without cost. Tommy had sustained a deep gash on his arm from a zombie's broken fingernail, and Maria had twisted her ankle badly while moving furniture. Sarah worked quickly to treat their injuries, using her medical supplies efficiently while keeping one eye on the barricaded entrances. The zombies had not retreated. Instead, they had settled into a pattern of continuous pressure, testing different entry points and seeming to learn from each failed attempt. Through the boarded windows, she could see them moving in the darkness, their silhouettes creating an almost military-like formation around the building. The most disturbing discovery came when Father O'Brien noticed that some of the zombies were using tools. A former construction worker among the infected had picked up a crowbar and was systematically working to pry open one of the reinforced doors, while others had begun stacking debris to reach higher windows. This wasn't the mindless behavior they had expected from the undead. This was adaptation, learning, evolution in real time. Sarah realized that their understanding of the infection was fundamentally flawed. These weren't just reanimated corpses driven by hunger. They were becoming something new, something that retained fragments of their former selves while being driven by an insatiable need to spread the infection further. By dawn, the immediate threat had subsided, but the survivors knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The zombies had withdrawn to the shadows, but they hadn't gone far. Sarah established radio contact with 4 other survivor groups, creating a network of desperate voices trying to coordinate their survival efforts. The infection was spreading faster than ever, and the undead were becoming increasingly dangerous. It was time to make a choice: stay and fight an enemy that was growing stronger, or risk everything in a desperate attempt to reach the safety of Fort Henderson. The gathering storm was far from over, and the survivors were about to face their greatest challenge yet. The convoy of 3 vehicles moved through the abandoned streets of Cedar Falls like ghosts from a forgotten world, their engines running as quietly as possible to avoid attracting the attention of the roaming hordes that had claimed the city as their domain. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, a reinforced SUV that Tommy had expertly modified with metal plates and wire mesh over the windows, while she studied the hand-drawn map that combined intelligence from all the survivor groups they had contacted over the radio. The decision to leave the community center had been unanimous after the previous night's assault, but the journey to Fort Henderson would take them through the heart of the infected zone, where thousands of zombies wandered the highways and side roads like a living nightmare that stretched as far as the eye could see. Behind them, the second vehicle carried Maria, Father O'Brien, and Emma, along with 4 other survivors they had rescued from a trapped group at the old fire station, while the third vehicle held Captain Reynolds and his remaining team members, battle-hardened individuals who had been fighting the undead for weeks and possessed invaluable knowledge about zombie behavior and combat tactics. The first major obstacle appeared as they approached the interstate overpass, where hundreds of abandoned cars created a massive traffic jam that had become a hunting ground for the infected. The vehicles were packed so tightly that there was no way to drive through, forcing the convoy to take a detour through the industrial district where the buildings provided some cover but also created perfect ambush points for any zombies that might be lurking in the shadows. Sarah's radio crackled with reports from the other vehicles: movement in the warehouse on the left, pack of at least 20 heading toward the road, we need to pick up the pace before they can surround us. The tension in each voice was palpable, reflecting the reality that they were traveling through territory that belonged to the dead, where every street corner could hide a threat and every decision could mean the difference between reaching safety and joining the ranks of the undead. As they navigated through the maze of abandoned buildings and debris-filled streets, the convoy encountered their first group of hostile survivors at what had once been a military checkpoint. These weren't the frightened, desperate people they had rescued from the fire station. These were hardened individuals who had chosen to prey on other survivors rather than work together against the zombie threat. The leader, a man who introduced himself only as Kane, emerged from behind a makeshift barricade with a rifle pointed directly at their windshield, flanked by a dozen armed followers who looked like they hadn't hesitated to take whatever they needed from anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. Kane's demands were simple: surrender half their supplies and weapons, or face the consequences of trying to pass through what he claimed was his territory. Sarah could see the calculating look in his eyes, the way he assessed their vehicles and the number of people in their group, clearly weighing whether it would be more profitable to rob them or simply kill them and take everything. The standoff lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours as Sarah watched Kane's people position themselves around the convoy while zombies began to gather at the edges of the area, drawn by the sound of voices and the smell of living humans. Captain Reynolds, whose military training had prepared him for situations like this, quietly coordinated with Tommy and Maria through the radio, planning a defensive strategy that would allow them to break through the hostile survivor's position without getting trapped in a prolonged firefight that would attract every zombie in the area. The tension reached a breaking point when Kane noticed the approaching undead and realized that his position was becoming untenable, forcing him to make a choice between continuing the confrontation and retreating to safety. In a moment of grudging respect for the convoy's determination and the growing zombie threat, Kane stepped aside and allowed them to pass, but not before warning them that the road ahead was filled with dangers far worse than anything they had encountered so far. The convoy pressed on through the increasingly dangerous landscape, where entire neighborhoods had been consumed by fire and the roads were littered with the remains of failed evacuation attempts. They passed through small towns where the infection had spread so completely that there were no survivors left, only empty buildings and roaming zombies that moved through the streets like a plague of locusts. At one point, they had to abandon their planned route entirely when they discovered that a bridge had been destroyed, forcing them to take a longer path that added hours to their journey and brought them dangerously close to several large zombie hordes. Sarah began to understand the true scope of the apocalypse as they traveled. This wasn't just a local outbreak that could be contained, but a global catastrophe that had transformed the world into something unrecognizable, where the living were vastly outnumbered by the dead and survival depended on luck, skill, and the willingness to make impossible choices. Fort Henderson lay ahead, but the journey was far from over, and each mile brought new challenges that tested their resolve and their ability to work together in the face of overwhelming odds. The abandoned shopping mall loomed before them like a monument to civilization's collapse, its shattered windows and twisted metal framework creating an eerie silhouette against the blood-red sunset that painted the sky in ominous hues. Sarah's convoy had been forced to take shelter here after their vehicles ran low on fuel, but what they discovered inside made her question everything she thought she knew about the infected and their capabilities. The zombies within the mall weren't wandering aimlessly as they had expected. Instead, they moved with purpose and organization, following what appeared to be a primitive hierarchy led by a creature that had once been human but now represented something far more terrifying. This alpha zombie, a former security guard whose name tag still read Marcus, retained enough intelligence to direct the others, pointing toward strategic positions and even using simple tools like crowbars and broken glass as weapons. The sight of an undead creature capable of planning and leadership sent chills down Sarah's spine, because it meant that the infection had evolved beyond their worst fears, creating predators that could think, adapt, and hunt with deadly efficiency. Captain Reynolds immediately recognized the tactical implications of what they were witnessing, his military training allowing him to see the patterns in the zombies' movements that others might miss. These weren't just random attacks. They were coordinated assaults designed to trap and overwhelm their prey, using the mall's layout to create killing zones where survivors would have no escape route. The alpha zombie had positioned sentries at key exits, while others had been stationed in elevated positions where they could observe and respond to threats. It was a level of organization that suggested the infection wasn't just reanimating dead tissue. It was creating a new form of intelligence, one that combined human cunning with an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Sarah watched in horror as Marcus directed a group of infected toward a family of survivors who had been trapped in the old department store, the zombies moving with the coordination of a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. The rescue mission that followed tested every member of the convoy's courage and resourcefulness, as they had to navigate through the mall's maze-like interior while avoiding the organized zombie patrols that seemed to anticipate their every move. Tommy's knowledge of electronics proved invaluable when he managed to restore power to a section of the mall, using the lighting system to create distractions that allowed them to move unseen through the corridors. Maria's construction background helped them identify structural weaknesses in the building that could be exploited to create escape routes, while Father O'Brien's calm leadership kept the group focused on their mission despite the overwhelming fear that threatened to paralyze them. Emma, despite her young age, had developed an uncanny ability to sense the presence of zombies before they became visible, her whispered warnings saving the group from several potential ambushes as they made their way deeper into the mall's dangerous interior. The confrontation with Marcus and his organized horde forced Sarah to make a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days, as she realized that traditional zombie fighting tactics were useless against an enemy that could think and plan. When Tommy was cornered by a group of infected in the old electronics store, Sarah had to choose between attempting a dangerous rescue that could get them all killed or abandoning him to save the rest of the group. The choice became even more agonizing when she discovered that the trapped family they had come to rescue included a young doctor whose medical knowledge could be crucial to their survival, but reaching him would require going through Marcus and his most dangerous followers. The battle that ensued was unlike anything they had experienced before, as the zombies used tactics that seemed almost military in their precision, creating flanking maneuvers and coordinated attacks that pushed the survivors to their absolute limits. The escape from the mall came at a terrible cost, as they lost 2 members of their group to the organized zombie assault, including one of Captain Reynolds' most experienced fighters who sacrificed himself to ensure the others could reach safety. But they also gained valuable intelligence about the infection's evolution and rescued Dr. James Morrison, whose research background would prove essential in understanding the true nature of the zombie threat. As they regrouped outside the mall and prepared to continue their journey to Fort Henderson, Sarah realized that they were no longer just trying to survive a zombie apocalypse. They were engaged in a war against an enemy that was learning to fight back with increasing sophistication and deadly purpose. The infection had created more than just mindless monsters. It had given birth to a new species of predator that combined human intelligence with supernatural persistence, and the survivors would need to evolve their own tactics if they hoped to survive the challenges that lay ahead. The hunters had become the hunted, and the rules of survival had fundamentally changed in ways that would test their humanity as much as their ability to stay alive in a world where the dead had learned to think, plan, and kill with terrifying efficiency. The massive concrete walls of Fort Henderson rose from the landscape like a beacon of hope in a world consumed by darkness, but as Sarah's convoy approached the military installation, the sight that greeted them was far from the sanctuary they had envisioned during their harrowing journey across the infected wasteland. Thousands of zombies surrounded the fortress in a living siege that stretched as far as the eye could see, their bodies pressed against the outer perimeter in waves that seemed to pulse with a collective hunger that defied comprehension. The undead had organized themselves into a systematic assault pattern, with the more intelligent alpha zombies positioning themselves at strategic points around the walls while the mindless hordes served as cannon fodder, throwing themselves against the fortifications in endless waves that tested the defenders' ammunition supplies and psychological endurance. Sarah could see the desperate faces of soldiers and civilians peering down from the ramparts, their weapons constantly firing into the mass of bodies below, but for every zombie that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, creating a nightmare scenario where the fortress had become both sanctuary and prison for the survivors trapped within its walls. The radio communications they intercepted painted a grim picture of life inside Fort Henderson, where over 3,000 civilians had sought refuge alongside the remaining military personnel, but resources were running dangerously low and tensions were reaching a breaking point between different factions of survivors. Colonel Martinez, the commanding officer, had implemented strict rationing protocols that were causing unrest among the civilian population, while a group led by a former politician named Senator Crawford was challenging the military's authority and demanding a more democratic approach to decision-making. Dr. Morrison, whose expertise in infectious diseases had quickly made him invaluable to the group, explained that the siege represented something unprecedented in zombie behavior. A coordinated, long-term strategy that suggested the infection had evolved to the point where the undead could engage in complex planning and resource management. The zombies weren't just attacking randomly, they were systematically weakening the fortress's defenses while preventing any supplies or reinforcements from reaching the survivors inside, creating a war of attrition that favored the side that didn't need food, water, or rest. Captain Reynolds devised a desperate plan to break through the zombie siege and reach the fortress, using the convoy's remaining fuel to create a series of diversionary explosions that would draw the undead away from a weak point in their formation. The plan required precise timing and coordination, as they would have only minutes to get through the gap before the zombies could reorganize and cut off their escape route. Sarah found herself questioning whether they were making the right choice, as the fortress appeared to be slowly falling despite its impressive defenses, but the alternative was to continue wandering the wasteland with dwindling supplies and no clear destination. Tommy volunteered to drive the lead vehicle, knowing that his skills behind the wheel would be crucial to their survival, while Maria and Father O'Brien worked to prepare Emma and the other non-combatants for what could be their final battle against the forces of the undead. The breakthrough attempt became a nightmarish gauntlet of death and destruction as the convoy raced through the gap in the zombie lines, their vehicles taking heavy damage from the clawing hands and gnashing teeth of the infected masses that pressed in from all sides. The fortress's defenders, recognizing the convoy's desperate situation, provided covering fire that helped clear a path to the main gate, but several zombies managed to climb onto the vehicles during the final approach, forcing the survivors to fight hand-to-hand combat while trying to maintain their momentum toward safety. Sarah watched in horror as one of the alpha zombies, displaying intelligence that still shocked her despite everything she had witnessed, attempted to coordinate an attack on their rear vehicle by directing other infected to create a roadblock using abandoned military equipment. The creature's tactical thinking was becoming more sophisticated with each encounter, suggesting that the infection was not just evolving but learning from each confrontation with human survivors. The convoy's arrival at Fort Henderson brought temporary relief, but it also introduced new challenges as the survivors found themselves caught between the external threat of the zombie siege and the internal politics of a community under extreme stress. Senator Crawford immediately began recruiting the newcomers to his cause, arguing that the military's authoritarian approach was destroying the democratic values they were fighting to preserve, while Colonel Martinez insisted that martial law was the only way to maintain order and survive the ongoing crisis. Sarah realized that the fortress might offer physical protection from the zombies, but it couldn't shield them from the human conflicts that were tearing the survivor community apart from within. The undead had learned to wage war with patience and strategy, but the living were destroying themselves through mistrust, fear, and the desperate struggle for control over their uncertain future, creating a situation where the greatest threat to their survival might not be the zombies outside the walls but the divisions among the survivors themselves. The classified documents scattered across the table in Colonel Martinez's command center painted a picture of deception and betrayal that reached the highest levels of government, as Dr. Morrison's trembling hands held a report that revealed the zombie infection had not been an accident but the result of a military bioweapons experiment designated Project Lazarus, that had been designed to create an army of enhanced soldiers who could continue fighting even after sustaining fatal injuries. Sarah felt her world crumble as she read the technical specifications that described how the experimental serum was intended to reanimate dead tissue while maintaining basic motor functions and following simple commands, but the project had gone catastrophically wrong when the test subjects retained their aggressive instincts while losing their humanity entirely. The documents revealed that the initial outbreak had occurred at a secret facility located 50 miles north of Cedar Falls, where Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the project's lead scientist and sister to the hostile survivor they had encountered during their journey, had been conducting illegal human experiments on prisoners and homeless individuals who had been abducted specifically for the research program. Senator Crawford's face had turned ashen as he discovered his own signature on several authorization forms that had provided funding for Project Lazarus, revealing that he had been complicit in the creation of the very nightmare that was now threatening to destroy humanity. The political implications were staggering, as the documents showed that dozens of high-ranking officials had known about the project and had chosen to cover it up rather than risk exposure, even after the initial containment failures had begun spreading the infection beyond the laboratory walls. Colonel Martinez admitted that he had been part of the military unit tasked with covering up the outbreak, but his conscience had prevented him from following orders to eliminate civilian witnesses, leading to his reassignment to Fort Henderson, where he had been effectively silenced through isolation and bureaucratic exile. The revelation that the zombie apocalypse had been caused by human greed and military ambition rather than natural disaster or foreign attack created a crisis of faith among the survivors, who had been fighting to preserve a civilization that had betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible. Dr. Morrison's analysis of the research data revealed that Dr. Kane had been working on a potential cure for the infection, but her notes indicated that the antidote required a specific combination of rare chemicals and genetic material that could only be obtained from the original laboratory where the experiments had been conducted. The facility, designated as Site Alpha, contained not only the cure but also detailed information about the infection's progression and potential weaknesses that could be exploited to develop more effective weapons against the evolved zombies. However, the laboratory was located in the heart of the infected zone, surrounded by thousands of zombies that had been drawn to the area by some unknown factor, possibly the presence of the original test subjects who had become incredibly powerful alpha zombies capable of commanding vast hordes of the undead. The mission to retrieve the cure would be essentially suicidal, requiring a small team to penetrate deep into enemy territory with no guarantee of success and almost no chance of survival. The debate over whether to attempt the mission divided the fortress community into bitter factions, with Senator Crawford arguing that they should focus on fortifying their current position and waiting for outside help, while Colonel Martinez insisted that offensive action was their only hope for long-term survival. Sarah found herself torn between her medical oath to heal and her responsibility to the people who had trusted her with their lives, knowing that the cure could save millions of people but that the mission would likely result in the deaths of everyone who volunteered to participate. The situation became even more complicated when Tommy volunteered to lead the mission, arguing that his youth and agility gave him the best chance of infiltrating the facility, but Sarah couldn't bear the thought of sending the teenager into what amounted to certain death. Father O'Brien provided spiritual counsel to those struggling with the moral implications of the revelation, but even his faith was shaken by the discovery that the apocalypse had been caused by human evil rather than divine judgment or natural catastrophe. The betrayal that shattered the fragile unity of the survivor community came from an unexpected source, as Dr. Morrison revealed that he had been in contact with Dr. Kane through encrypted radio transmissions, and that she had promised to provide him with the cure in exchange for detailed information about the fortress's defenses and the survivors' capabilities. Morrison's justification was that he was trying to save everyone by negotiating a peaceful solution, but his actions had provided the zombie hordes with strategic intelligence that explained their increasingly effective siege tactics and coordinated attacks. The revelation that one of their own had been feeding information to the enemy created a paranoid atmosphere within the fortress, where trust became a luxury that no one could afford and every decision carried the weight of potential betrayal. Sarah realized that the mission to retrieve the cure was no longer just about saving humanity, it was about confronting the source of the infection and the human failures that had created it, even if it meant sacrificing everything they had fought to preserve. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air as Sarah's strike team approached Site Alpha, the original laboratory facility that had become ground zero for humanity's darkest nightmare, and what they saw below defied every assumption they had made about the zombie infection's scope and intelligence. The facility was surrounded by a massive crater where the initial explosion had occurred, but instead of the ruins they expected to find, the laboratory had been rebuilt and expanded by the zombies themselves, using salvaged materials and an architectural design that seemed to follow some alien logic that prioritized function over human aesthetics. Thousands of infected individuals moved through the complex with purpose and coordination that suggested they had retained not just basic motor skills but also the ability to engage in complex construction projects, creating a stronghold that served as both breeding ground and command center for the zombie hordes that had spread across the continent. Dr. Elizabeth Kane's voice crackled through the radio as she welcomed them to her transformed laboratory, explaining that the infection had evolved far beyond her original design and had created something that transcended the boundary between life and death, offering humanity a chance to join a new form of existence that eliminated pain, fear, and the limitations of mortal flesh. Sarah's team consisted of the most skilled and desperate volunteers from Fort Henderson. Tommy, whose mechanical expertise and fearless determination had made him invaluable during their journey. Captain Reynolds, whose military training and tactical knowledge gave them their best chance of surviving the mission. Maria, whose construction background helped them understand the facility's modified structure. And Father O'Brien, whose spiritual strength provided the moral foundation they needed to face the horrors that awaited them inside the laboratory. The plan was devastatingly simple. Infiltrate the facility, locate the cure, and transmit the formula to Fort Henderson before the zombies could stop them, but the reality proved far more complex as they discovered that the laboratory had become a living organism that responded to their presence with defensive mechanisms that seemed to anticipate their every move. The walls themselves appeared to be covered with a bioorganic substance that pulsed with its own rhythm, while the air was filled with spores that caused hallucinations and disorientation among anyone who breathed them for extended periods. The deeper they penetrated into the facility, the more they realized that Dr. Kane's experiments had created something that challenged the very definition of life and consciousness, as they encountered zombies who retained enough of their former personalities to engage in complex conversations while simultaneously exhibiting the relentless hunger and aggression that characterized the infected. These evolved zombies served as Kane's research assistants and bodyguards, conducting experiments on captured survivors and working to perfect the infection spread through genetic manipulation and chemical enhancement. Sarah watched in horror as they passed through laboratories where living humans were being used as test subjects for new strains of the infection, their screams echoing through corridors that had been designed to study the boundaries between humanity and monstrosity. The cure they sought was hidden in the deepest levels of the facility, protected by Kane's most advanced creations. Alpha zombies who had retained their human intelligence while gaining supernatural strength and resilience that made them nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. The confrontation with Dr. Kane herself revealed the true horror of what the infection had become, as the woman who had once been a respected scientist had voluntarily infected herself with an experimental strain that allowed her to maintain her human consciousness while gaining the ability to control and communicate with the zombie hordes. Kane explained that she had come to see the infection not as a curse but as humanity's next evolutionary step, offering immortality and freedom from the physical and emotional limitations that had always constrained human potential. She offered Sarah and her team the chance to join her in creating a new world where the boundaries between life and death had been erased, where suffering was eliminated through the transformation of human consciousness into something that could experience existence without the fear of mortality. The laboratory's final defense system activated as Kane realized that Sarah's team could not be converted to her cause, releasing waves of enhanced zombies that had been specifically designed to counter human military tactics and weapons. The escape from Site Alpha became a race against time as the facility's self-destruct mechanism activated, triggered by Tommy's sabotage of the laboratory's power systems in a desperate attempt to destroy Kane's research and prevent the creation of more advanced zombie strains. Sarah managed to transmit the cure formula to Fort Henderson just as the building began to collapse around them, but the cost of their mission was devastating as they lost Captain Reynolds to Kane's final assault and Father O'Brien to the facility's collapsing structure. The helicopter extraction became a nightmare of fire and falling debris as the laboratory exploded in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles, taking with it the secrets of the infection's origin and the woman who had created humanity's greatest threat. Sarah and the surviving members of her team flew away from the burning ruins with the cure in their possession, but they also carried the terrible knowledge that the infection had evolved beyond anything they had imagined, and that their victory might be temporary at best in a world where the dead had learned to think, plan, and dream of a future without the living. The radio transmission that Sarah sent from the burning ruins of Site Alpha reached Fort Henderson just as the zombie siege reached its critical breaking point, but the cure formula she had risked everything to obtain presented the survivors with an impossible choice that would determine not just their own fate but the future of human civilization itself. The serum required to neutralize the infection could be synthesized using the laboratory equipment within the fortress, but there was only enough raw material to create a limited quantity that could either save the 3,000 survivors trapped within the walls or be used to develop an airborne version that could potentially cure millions of infected individuals across the continent. Colonel Martinez argued for immediate production of individual doses that would guarantee the survival of everyone in the fortress, while Senator Crawford insisted that they had a moral obligation to sacrifice their own safety for the greater good of humanity, even if it meant risking the lives of everyone they had fought so hard to protect. Sarah found herself at the center of this agonizing debate, her medical training telling her to save the patients she could reach while her conscience demanded that she consider the broader implications of their decision for the countless survivors still fighting for their lives in other locations around the world. The synthesis process began under Dr. Morrison's supervision, despite the betrayal that had nearly cost them everything, because his expertise in biochemistry was essential to creating a stable and effective version of the cure. The irony was not lost on Sarah that the man who had nearly destroyed them was now their best hope for salvation, but she recognized that redemption sometimes came through the opportunity to correct past mistakes rather than through punishment for previous failures. Tommy worked tirelessly to maintain the laboratory equipment despite the constant bombardment from the zombie hordes outside, while Maria coordinated the fortress's defenses to buy them the time they needed to complete the synthesis process. Emma, who had shown remarkable resilience throughout their journey, helped organize the civilian population and provided emotional support to families who were struggling with the uncertainty of their situation and the weight of the decision that would determine their collective future. The breakthrough came when Dr. Morrison discovered that the cure could be modified to create both immediate individual doses and a reproductive strain that would spread naturally through zombie populations, essentially turning the infection's own transmission mechanisms against itself. This hybrid approach would allow them to save the fortress survivors while also launching a biological counterattack that could gradually reclaim infected territory over time, but it required a delivery system that would expose volunteers to extreme danger as they carried the cure into zombie-controlled areas. Sarah volunteered to lead the first distribution mission, knowing that her medical knowledge would be crucial to administering the cure effectively, but also recognizing that someone needed to take responsibility for the decision to risk everything on an untested solution that might fail catastrophically if the zombies had evolved immunities that they hadn't anticipated. The implementation of the cure began at dawn, as teams of volunteers ventured outside the fortress walls to begin the systematic treatment of infected individuals, starting with recently turned zombies who retained enough human physiology to respond to the serum effectively. The results were both miraculous and heartbreaking, as some zombies immediately returned to human consciousness while others simply collapsed as their reanimated bodies finally found peace in true death. Sarah watched with mixed emotions as former enemies became confused and frightened survivors who had no memory of their time as infected creatures, their return to humanity serving as both a victory and a reminder of all the people who had been lost during the long nightmare of the apocalypse. The airborne version of the cure was released from the fortress's highest tower, carried by winds that would spread it across hundreds of miles of infected territory, beginning a slow but irreversible process of reclaiming the world from the zombie hordes that had dominated it for so long. The epilogue took place 6 months after the cure's deployment, as Sarah stood on the walls of Fort Henderson and watched the sunrise over a landscape that was gradually returning to life, with small communities of survivors emerging from hiding places to begin the long process of rebuilding civilization. The zombie threat had not been completely eliminated, as some infected individuals in remote areas remained beyond the cure's reach, but the massive hordes that had once threatened humanity's extinction were now reduced to scattered groups that could be handled by conventional military forces. Tommy had become a leader among the younger survivors, organizing expeditions to establish contact with other communities and share the cure with anyone who needed it, while Maria supervised construction projects that were expanding Fort Henderson into a proper city capable of supporting a growing population. Emma had started attending classes taught by Father O'Brien and other educated survivors, representing the hope that future generations would learn from the mistakes that had led to the apocalypse while building a better world on the foundations of the one that had been lost. Sarah continued her work as a doctor, but now she treated patients who were recovering from the trauma of survival rather than fighting for their lives against impossible odds, and she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies but from choosing to preserve the values and compassion that made humanity worth saving in the first place.